In moments like this, facts don't arrive quietly. They arrive late, after emotions have already taken the room. What began as a headline about a married couple shot by a federal agent quickly became something else. Protests in the streets, outrage from elected leaders, and a familiar accusation: federal power run amok. Then the counter-story landed. Hard, unapologetic. The Department of Homeland Security didn't just dispute the narrative, it detonated it. Two individuals, DHS says, were not innocent victims, but illegal entrants, suspected gang affiliates, accused of turning a vehicle into a weapon. Same event, two realities. This is no longer just about a shooting in Portland. It's about how modern politics works. Narratives move faster than investigations. Moral certainty travels faster than complexity. If you care about truth, not the comforting kind, but the uncomfortable kind, stay with me. Because to understand what's happening here, we need to step back before we rush forward. And that's where the real story begins. To understand this moment, we have to slow the picture down. Strip away the slogans. Ignore the chants. Look only at the structure of what unfolded. There is an incident involving federal immigration agents. There is an immediate public framing, emotionally potent, morally clean, easy to understand, and then there is an institutional response, dense with allegations, legal language, and claims that complicate the original story. These are not competing facts yet. They are competing frames. On one side, Democratic leaders describe a pattern of reckless federal force, inflamed by national politics and imposed on local communities. On the other, DHS describes a law enforcement encounter involving illegal entry, suspected gang ties, and a split-second claim of self-defense. Both sides speak with certainty. Both demand accountability, but for different villains. And here's the key point. In modern America, the first narrative often becomes the emotional verdict. Everything that follows is treated as a rebuttal, not evidence. To see why this pattern keeps repeating, we have to look backward not at this incident, but at the system that produced it. To see where this comes from, we have to examine the backdrop that made this collision almost inevitable. Start with immigration enforcement itself, an arena where policy, politics, and human consequence constantly overlap. According to DHS, both individuals involved had entered the United States illegally and were released into the country. That fact alone sits at the center of today's political divide. Over time, immigration has stopped being treated as a technical challenge and started being framed as a moral identity test. Enforcement becomes cruelty. Restraint becomes weakness. Every incident is pulled into a larger story about what kind of country America is or is becoming. Layer onto that the rise of mass protest culture and real-time media. When violence intersects with immigration enforcement, the reaction is almost automatic. Outrage first, investigation later. Local leaders demand halts. National figures assign blame upward to administrations, to ideology, to intent, but institutions respond differently. They speak in allegations, affiliations, past arrests, legal status, cold details meant to reassert authority and reclaim narrative ground. These two systems don't just clash. They operate on different clocks, and when they collide, something breaks. That break is where the first real crisis emerges. The first rupture happens when the story escapes the scene and enters the street. After the shooting, the facts were still thin, but the reaction was not. Protests erupted. Outrage spread. Democratic leaders moved quickly not to wait, but to condemn. Portland's mayor called for federal agents to halt operations entirely. The governor described the incident as the product of a reckless national agenda. A U.S. senator warned that federal deployment itself was inflaming violence. The moral verdict arrived before the investigation. Then DHS responded not cautiously, but forcefully. It named the individuals. It alleged gang affiliation. It described a vehicle turned into a weapon, and it used language designed to shock, calling the original reporting revolting lies. This is the first crisis, not just a shooting, but a narrative collapse. Two versions of reality now exist side by side. Each claims moral clarity. Each denies the legitimacy of the other. If you're watching this unfold and feeling disoriented, that's not an accident. This is how modern political conflict is experienced, through rupture, not resolution. But beneath the outrage is a deeper question. What system produces this kind of collision again and again? That's what we need to unpack next. Beneath the shouting, there is a mechanism quietly doing its work. It begins with release without resolution. According to DHS, both individuals entered the country illegally and were released into the interior. That decision doesn't end a case, it suspends it. Legal status remains unresolved, enforcement remains pending, and risk remains distributed across communities. Then comes narrative compression. When a confrontation turns violent, complexity collapses. Actors are simplified into victims or villains. Early labels harden fast because moral clarity travels better than procedural nuance. Next is institutional overcorrection. Faced with public outrage, agencies respond not just with facts, but with forceful framing past arrests, alleged affiliations, incendiary language. The goal is not only to explain, but to reclaim authority. None of this requires bad faith. It requires incentives. Political leaders respond to voters. Agencies respond to legitimacy threats. Media responds to immediacy. And when a vehicle becomes a weapon or is alleged to the system has no soft landing, only escalation. This is why these moments feel inevitable. They are not accidents, they are outcomes, and once the mechanism spins up, it rarely stops with one incident. Which brings us to the second surge, faster, broader, and more destabilizing. The second surge comes when one incident becomes a pattern. This shooting did not stand alone. It followed another in another city under eerily similar claims. An ICE agent, a vehicle, a split-second decision framed as self-defense, and a protester left dead. From there, the reaction multiplied. Mass demonstrations spread across cities. The language hardened. Federal enforcement was no longer responding to events. It was now accused of producing them. Here's why this matters. Once separate incidents are mentally linked, the debate shifts. It is no longer about what happened in Portland. It becomes about intent, policy, and direction. Is enforcement restoring order or provoking chaos? DHS insists these are isolated acts of defense. Democratic leaders describe a national strategy of intimidation. Each new incident is absorbed into the same storyline, reinforcing prior beliefs. This is the second crisis, escalation through accumulation. Facts don't get weighed, they get stacked, and when enough weight builds up, it doesn't just bend institutions. It presses down on ordinary people, the ones caught between fear, anger, and confusion. That pressure is what we need to talk about next. If you're watching this as a citizen, not a partisan, this is where it starts to feel personal. Because you are not debating policy in a briefing room. You are absorbing it through fear, through anger, through uncertainty. If you live in a city like Portland, you're told federal agents are endangering your community. If you live elsewhere, you're told violent criminals were released into the country and confronted law enforcement. Both stories ask something from you, your trust, your outrage, your silence, and here's the quiet cost: confusion. When narratives harden this fast, people stop asking what happened and start asking, who do I side with? That's exhausting. It fractures communities. It turns neighbors into symbols. You shouldn't have to choose between safety and compassion. You shouldn't have to pick between believing victims or believing institutions, but this system forces that choice again and again. If you felt that tension, that sense that the truth is always one step behind the outrage, you're not alone. Pause here. share this conversation, because understanding how we got here is the first step toward not repeating it. And the consequences don't stop at city limits. They ripple outward. When these moments scale up, they stop being local controversies and start becoming signals. Signals watched by allies, adversaries, and governments far beyond Portland. What they see is not just a dispute over immigration enforcement. They see a country arguing in public over the legitimacy of its own institutions. Federal agencies issuing harsh counter-narratives, local leaders openly rejecting federal authority, street protests becoming a recurring response to law enforcement action. This matters because credibility is cumulative. When a nation cannot agree on what happened inside its own borders, it struggles to project clarity outside them. Immigration enforcement becomes a proxy for something larger. Who governs? Whose authority counts? And what happens when that authority is contested in real time? According to the pattern in your sample, each incident feeds the next. Domestic unrest justifies stronger enforcement. Stronger enforcement fuels further outrage. The cycle becomes visible and exploitable. This is how internal disputes turn into geopolitical vulnerabilities, not through invasion or collapse, but through erosion. And once erosion sets in, the future stops being singular. It splits. That brings us to what happens next. Not predictions, but paths. Looking forward from here, 3 paths emerge, not guesses, but logical extensions of what you've already seen. The first is containment. Investigations proceed. Rhetoric cools. Institutions absorb the shock and move on. In this scenario, incidents remain tragic but bounded. The system bends but doesn't break. Trust doesn't recover, but it stabilizes. The second path is normalization. These confrontations keep happening. Each one sparks protest, counterclaims, and political blame. Outrage becomes routine. So does escalation. The public grows numb, not because the stakes are lower, but because exhaustion sets in. And then there is the third path, fracture. Federal authority is openly resisted. Local leaders refuse cooperation. Agencies double down. Every encounter is preloaded with suspicion, cameras, and crowds. At that point, violence doesn't just risk happening, it's expected. None of these futures are chosen by one election or one leader. They are shaped by incentives, narratives, and reactions repeated over time. History shows us something uncomfortable. Systems rarely collapse from one shock. They unravel from unresolved ones. Which leaves us with a final question, not about policy, but about responsibility. And that's where we end. So let me leave you with this. What you've just watched unfold is not a debate about immigration alone. It is a test of how a society processes force, fear, and information all at once. When every incident becomes a symbol, truth becomes collateral. When every response is political, accountability becomes optional. And when narratives harden faster than facts, trust has no time to form. DHS insists it is defending lives. Democratic leaders insist communities are under threat. Both claims can exist and still fail the public if the system rewards escalation over clarity. The most dangerous outcome isn't choosing the wrong side. It's accepting that sides are all that matter. If you want a future where safety and compassion are not mutually exclusive, then this cycle has to be understood before it can be broken. That starts with resisting instant certainty and demanding something harder: process, patience, and proportion. If this analysis helped you see the structure beneath the outrage, share it, talk about it, and stay with me because the next conversation will go deeper into how narratives don't just describe power.